And then, okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We have some attendees are kind of streaming into the webinar, so we're just gonna take a minute or two, but thank you so much for coming out tonight. We realize there's a lot going on. It's a really busy night, and we really appreciate you being here. Let's see. I will also say that if any of you have any questions for our panelists, we will be, feel free to send them to us via the chat box. We have some neighborhood center staff who are behind the scenes taking care of those questions for us. So we're really grateful that they're here too. But if you have any questions that you already know you want to ask, just feel free to send them our way, and we'll take a look at them and do our best to get those answered. Okay, yeah, and we're just gonna, like I said, we're just gonna wait a couple more minutes. This is, yeah, so this is our, as some of you know, this is our One Richmond Racial Equity Series, and this is our second forum. The topic tonight is on API and Black Solidarity, and we are just so excited to be here and really excited to have our panelists who are joining us tonight. As I was saying before, if you have any questions that you'd like to address to the panelists, feel free to send them to us via the chat box. The format of the evening is we're going to start and have our panelists are going to each present, and then we're pretty much going to go right into a Q&A. And so those are the questions that you all have about this topic. So that's, and then, it's going to go by pretty fast. So we're just going to pretty much stay with that format. We're very excited to hear from tonight's panelists. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Naomi. I am the Community Relations Manager at the Richmond Neighborhood Center. We started this series back in July. Our first forum was on the anti-Asian racism. And so we're kind of building on that one with tonight's forum on API and Black Solidarity. And we're pretty much organizing these panels once a quarter, and it's been really great to do that in the Richmond. So we're just really excited to be here. Before I introduce them, I again want to thank you all for coming out tonight. It's just great to work together and talk together about these difficult issues. So thank you for coming. Now I'd like to introduce the panelists. First, I'll introduce Kevine Boggess. He is the Education Policy Director at Coleman Advocates, and he's also a Richmond District resident. So thank you for coming out tonight, Kevine. And second, I would like to introduce Dyan Ruiz. She is the co-founder of People Power Media, and she's also a Richmond District resident. So thanks so much, Dyan, for coming out tonight. And I also want to introduce our supervisor, who I'm sure most of you know, Sandra Lee Fewer, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Definitely looking forward to hearing from all of our leaders in the Richmond. And now I would like to introduce Michelle Cusano. She is the Executive Director of the Richmond Neighborhood Center. She's also my boss, great person to work for. So I'm going to pass it to you, Michelle.
Great, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Naomi, for those introductions. It's so great to see everybody through the participants list that I can see, and people that we know from our community that are here tonight to learn about such an important topic. So as Naomi said, like this topic is especially important to us at the Richmond Neighborhood Center, because we believe that no child should live in fear of walking to school or walking on the streets and being called a racial slur, or having been treated or being a victim of racial injustice. So that's why this is really important to us as an organization. And we've been having a lot of internal talks with our staff, and and I'm sure many of you are having with your families and your friends. And we thought, what can we do to bring this to the community? What can we do to encourage our neighbors and our community to have these conversations with each other? Because we're not going to be able to learn and get better at being a truly anti-racist neighborhood if we're not having these conversations with each other. That's why we brought this panel together to have these, to just start this in a safe space where people can ask questions and learn about things that they can take with them back into the community, so that we can make sure that the people that live here in the Richmond feel safe and are able to thrive here. That's our ultimate goal. So yeah, and we want to just take a deeper dive today. When we see in our neighborhood our Black Lives Matter signs that are hanging in our merchants' doors, and our neighbors have signs in their windows, what does that mean? And then what does it also mean when our Asian community is seeing an uptick of anti-Asian racism that's happening as well? So this is truly about us to dive deep into those issues and to learn how to be better allies and accomplices, and to have those tools that we need to make the Richmond the place that we want it to be. And we know it is, and it can be, and like really rise up to that challenge. So that's why we're here today. And like I said, this is a place that we want it to be safe. We want to be able to have these conversations and recognize that everybody's at a different place of learning and evolution towards understanding these issues. And so we want to make sure that people can ask questions and feel comfortable doing that with our community. So, and then to make it a little fun, because we always want to make sure that we have some incentives for people to ask questions and participate. And the way we're going to do that is if you ask a question in the, I believe it's in the Q&A or the chat, you will be listed in for a raffle to win a prize of this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So we have a few of these books to raffle off, and we will do that at the end. So we encourage you to participate. So thank you so much, and I believe we can get started. Naomi, are we ready?
Yeah. Okay.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump in here. Our first panelist that we're going to hear from is Dyan. Take it away, Dyan.
Thank you. So I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and you'll see it right now. All right, thumbs up that everything's looking all right? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the intersection of the API and Black experience of systemic racism in San Francisco. Unfortunately, there is a lot of stuff to go over. There's a lot of material on this topic, but I am going to be focusing on African Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and Filipino Americans. I just want to note that I know that none of these identities are a monolith, but they do have some shared experience with systemic racism. So this is the overview of the topics I'm going to cover. Labor exploitation, violent discrimination, anti-miscegenation or anti-mixed marriage laws, and the links between the forced segregation of communities and gentrification by way of redlining, redevelopment, white flight, and overall disinvestment, and kind of trying to end on an up note with some historical photos of solidarity. Okay. So when it comes to labor exploitation, so this was an article, this was taken from an article in the Chronicle just this past Sunday. This photo is of an African-American miner during the gold rush era taken in 1852. The man was photographed working in the Sierra foothills. So California joined the Union as a non-slavery state in 1850, but hundreds of enslaved people were already living in the state at the time and forced to work in mines and plantations. Many of these first Black residents weren't set free when the state passed its constitution, and the state permitted white prospectors from the South to keep their slaves. So in the South, you had the cotton fields, and here you had the gold mines. This is a photo of a Chinese tea carrier at a tunnel while building the connection between the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad, taken around 1867. The labor of these Chinese workers who built the western leg of the railroad across the Sierra Nevada mountains is largely forgotten. From 1863 to 1869, roughly 15,000 Chinese workers built that railroad. They made up most of the workforce between Sacramento and Promontory, Utah. They were paid less than the American workers and lived in tents while the whites lived in the train cars. The work was tiresome, manually shoveling several pounds of rocks hundreds of times a day. It was extremely dangerous, and hundreds of workers were killed. And this is a photo of the United Farm Workers leader, Larry Itliong, who along with Cesar Chavez led the Delano grape strike in the 1960s that led to an international boycott of table grapes. The Filipino farm workers were actually the first to vote to strike for better working conditions in September 1965. The next morning, they went onto the vineyards and they left the crop on the ground and walked out. Cesar Chavez and others like Dolores Huerta have been organizing Mexican workers around Delano for a few years, but a strike wasn't in their immediate plans. Itliong urged them to join their strike, and they did, and the unions came together to become the United Farm Workers. Many farm workers in general lived in San Francisco in the off-season, and many new immigrants ended up settling in the city. But because of discrimination, many people of color and new immigrants were hired for non-professional jobs, such as janitorial, laundry, and hotels. So when it comes to violent discrimination, so this is a photo that depicts the labor gathering of about 8,000 people that soon devolved into a racist anti-Chinese mob in July 1877. The United States was suffering from the Long Depression. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, many Chinese went to San Francisco and more came from China. The so-called Working Men's Party was furious at Chinese immigrants who worked for less. The mobs destroyed property, burned Chinese laundries, ripped up sidewalks to use as battering rams, broke into Chinese businesses to steal money and valuables, and shot anyone who opposed them. By the morning of July 25th, 3 men were dead and about $100,000 worth of Chinese-owned property was destroyed. One victim's name was Wang Go. The anti-Chinese sentiment culminated in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act halting Chinese immigration and barring Chinese from becoming US citizens. This act wasn't fully dismantled until 1965. So in February 1942, President Roosevelt signed an executive order forcing 110,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast, including more than 5,000 from San Francisco, to be incarcerated in internment camps. Japanese families lived in San Francisco beginning in the mid-1800s. By 1942, some established businesses had been passed down through multiple generations. Now the Japanese community in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack was treated like an enemy population. Any person of Japanese ancestry was required to sell their belongings, give up their homes, and move into temporary relocation camps, usually racetracks like Tanforan and San Mateo, while internment facilities were built in the interior of the country. And also, more recently, a review of police data by the Chronicle in June said that last year, in 2019, roughly 45% of the police use of force incidents in San Francisco involved African Americans. African Americans make up just 5% of the city's population. This proportion has remained more or less unchanged since 2016, even as the total number of reported cases of use of force fell nearly twofold. And here's a picture of Mario Woods, 26-year-old shot in the Bayview by police officers in 2015. Jessica Williams, a 29-year-old woman shot in the Bayview by police officers in 2016. And Oscar Grant, a 22-year-old shot at the Fruitvale BART station in 2009. Okay. So other laws that, were discriminatory was anti-mixed marriage laws. So basically laws that prohibit marriage between races, but this almost always meant making it illegal for people of color to marry whites. California's anti-miscegenation law was first passed in 1850. It banned Blacks, Asians, and Filipinos from marrying whites. It was repealed in 1948. So as kind of one of the kind of consequences of this, so after World War II, many former servicemen from the Philippines who fought for the US emigrated to San Francisco. They were unable to marry, so they remained bachelors until their old age. This is why when many people were evicted from the I Hotel in 1977, many were manongs or Filipino male elders who had nowhere else to live. Okay, so going to segregation and gentrification. So you can actually draw a straight line, in fact, many straight lines, linking segregation policies of the past and the gentrification and economic vulnerability of people of color now. So segregation means keeping people apart. In this case, we're talking about whites and people of color. So one major policy relating to this is redlining. So before redlining, there were racist laws and banking practices that prohibited people of color, especially immigrants to the US, from being able to own property. These were strictly enforced in most areas of the cities, which is why ethnic enclaves such as Chinatown, Nihonmachi, which is called Japantown now, and Manilatown were formed. And now redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. So this policy is so named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed the riskiest. These neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color. This was no accident. The hazardous rating was in large part based on racial demographics. This map from the 1930s indicates the San Francisco residential zones that are best in green, still desirable in blue, definitely declining in yellow, and hazardous in red. So you can see D3 hazardous is the Fillmore, Japantown, Western Addition area, kind of in the top middle of the map. And A3 would be like Presidio Heights. Redlining was an explicitly discriminatory policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or maintenance and led to cycles of disinvestment. So all of this can be found in the urbandisplacement.org website. It's UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project. There's also an interactive map from the University of Richmond where you can actually see redlining maps from all over the US, because this wasn't just in San Francisco. Okay. So redevelopment was also a major thing that affected all of these communities. So around the 1950s, white people in capital began leaving the inner cities because of other housing and transportation policies, which fueled the growth of mostly white suburbs. This phenomenon was called white flight. So one such policy was the GI Bill, the program that guaranteed low-cost mortgage loans for returning World War II veterans. But discrimination limited the extent to which Black and other veterans were able to purchase homes in the suburbs. In fact, the FHA largely required suburban developers to agree not to sell houses to Black people to access these loans. So also happening in the 1950s is redevelopment or urban renewal. So basically low-income households and communities of color bore the brunt of highway system expansion and mega projects, as they were left behind in central city neighborhoods because of white flight. Redevelopment was enabled by federal and state law and implemented by cities. In order to create a redevelopment project area, the city agency needed an approved so-called blight study. These urban renewal projects resulted in the mass clearance of homes, businesses, and neighborhoods into institutions, and set the stage for widespread public and private disinvestment in the decades that followed. Areas targeted by redevelopment in San Francisco include the Fillmore, Western Addition, Nihon Machi or Japantown, and the South of Market. So basically, the prevailing wisdom for many decades in the last century was that raising slums was key to reviving city centers. So before redevelopment, the Fillmore was actually a thriving commercial district and very multicultural. Many Blacks, Jews, Japanese, Filipinos, and Hispanics lived there and had businesses there. Black nightclubs and restaurants offering live entertainment made it into the Harlem of the West. In 1947, the SF Planning Commission submitted a proposal to raise and rebuild a 36-block zone in the Western Addition. Blight reports characterized Fillmore as a magnet for crime, but it seemed like these beautiful Victorian buildings and all those businesses were only blighted because they were populated by Black people, many of whom could not get loans to fix up their property because of redlining. So during this pre-civil rights era, few residents had much recourse, although many did fight against redevelopment. And the other area of redevelopment was Nihon Machi, or it's called Japantown now. So the giant mall known as Japantown was once the thriving center of the Japanese American community in San Francisco. In the period before World War II, the Japanese American neighborhood, then called Nihon Machi, was roughly 20 square blocks and housed 95% of the city's Japanese Americans. After their forced displacement from internment, many did return to San Francisco. They did form a coalition of people against redevelopment, but ultimately redevelopment won, and also big corporations like the Kintetsu Corporation prevailed and conspired to build what some call a Japanese theme park mall that you have today. So there's a lot of businesses, but not a lot of residents of Japanese descent. So another part of redevelopment was also the widening of Geary Boulevard and the building of the underpass at Fillmore and Geary, which displaced residents and divided the Black and Japanese communities. So these photos are courtesy of Janet Delaney. You can find them on her website and in her books. So the South of Market was home to many working class people who worked in the nearby docks, railroads, factories, and hotels. It was a landing place for many immigrants, such as the Irish and Filipinos. But you can see this quotation from Justin Herman, the executive director of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. He said, "This land is too valuable to permit poor people to park on it." So that basically sums up what redevelopment was all about. So plans to redevelop the area began in 1952, and what followed was the removal of 4,000 residents and more than 700 businesses. In 1969, local residents and owners formed a group to file lawsuits that delayed redevelopment and reshaped its ultimate manifestation. So basically, redevelopment is how we got the Moscone Convention Center, SF MoMA, and Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. So redlining, urban renewal, white flight, and many other policies and practices created racialized patterns of disinvestment in central cities that left communities of color particularly susceptible to gentrification. As you can see on the map of San Francisco, you can see overlap in the areas of redlining and gentrification. So this UC Berkeley project has identified that 87% of today's gentrifying areas were rated as hazardous for investment during redlining. It's this disinvestment that has primed communities for gentrification. So gentrification is the process of neighborhood change, including economic change in a historically disinvested neighborhood. It's done by real estate investment and new higher income residents moving in. It's marked by a demographic change not only in terms of income level, but education and racial makeup of its residents. So yeah, there's a lot to go over, but I did see some really beautiful photos of solidarity historically as well. So there are many instances of solidarity between Asians and between Asians and Black communities in all of these struggles, as well as others like the SF State student strikes. So this one wanted to call out is a civil rights activist, Yuri Kochiyama, who is a member of Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity and was a friend to Martin Luther King. She did many amazing things, including fighting for reparations for Japanese American internees. And this is a photo of a march in 1964 protesting the assault of an Asian store owner, Park Hui. Then these were called the Youth for Service Boys. And that's the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Dyan. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Just before we move on, I just want to remind everyone, all of you, if you have any questions for us, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. And we can, when we get to the Q&A, we can go over those. All right, so next we have our D1 supervisor, Sandra Lee-Feuer.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Michelle and Naomi, for putting this on and giving me an opportunity actually to share sort of my experiences as, you know, a fourth generation Chinese American, Chinese San Franciscan, quite frankly, and also as the supervisor of District 1. I think that Dyan's presentation was excellent. It leads itself right into what I was going to talk about, is about really the shared oppression that African Americans and Asians also have, that we also share so much of an oppressive background and systemic racism. For example, racism in front of housing. I mean, you know, I'm a fourth generation San Franciscan. My uncles were not allowed to buy in Westlake. Dolger would not sell them a home. They could not buy in the Sunset. So there were areas also that they were not permitted to live in and to buy homes in. And you can see that this also affects not only our Black residents, but also Black community, but also our other communities of color. And then also when we talk about institutionalized racism, that we look at our banks and who has really oppressed people of color and shared sort of the shared experience with African Americans and also Asians, is that their banks would not loan to them. Asians had their own family association networks to loan money from. There weren't any Black-owned banks in San Francisco, although in Atlanta there are. So I just think this type of institutionalized racism is something that we share as an Asian community and a Black community. And then let's talk about educational disparities. That actually the Black community has had to sue multiple times for an equitable education and is still not receiving one through our public school systems here in the United States, and absolutely not here in San Francisco too. And so we've also had to have lawsuits for our bilingual students or students who are English language learners, and to have extra services for them. And that was all done through the courts. I think that the Asian community and the Black community has had to turn to the courts actually for relief, and also to fight for what any other populations were actually receiving. And so we have this shared sort of history of institutionalized racism. And this brings us to actually my job too, because I think that we all as city officials have a responsibility also to bring communities together. And people ask me why, and I say, well, we are San Francisco, and I actually think our values, what we are based on here in San Francisco is really about inclusion. If we want to be truthful about it, quite frankly, the self-proclaimed most progressive city in the United States is systemically racist. And that is why it is up to us to actually look at these systems of racism and try to break them down. It is the responsibility of your city government and your city leaders and your national leaders actually to have the conversation, but also to lead the conversation about equity and race. And I think that we as a country have a really hard time talking about race, but especially I just want to say that amongst people of color, we have a hard time talking about race. There's not a safe place. And so I'm so glad today that we have created a safe place actually to talk about race, to what we have in common, particularly with our Asian communities and our African-American communities. I think that we share more than we realize. There are things that do separate us, but there are things that actually can bring us together. The responsibility of city government actually to really tweak those factors that actually cause this great divide. When you look at a wealth divide, when you look at communities pitted against each other, in particular communities of color, we often see, and this is the root cause really of crime, is about this lack of opportunity and also who and people who are suffering. And so it is designed, quite frankly, for us to be fighting each other as people of color because we are fighting over the crumbs, right? And so, but really, I think what we need to do is really turn to our attention to how can we achieve a peaceful place to live here in San Francisco amongst our differences and come together in a nonviolent way to talk also about race and how we can support each other as people of color. And I don't think we've really had that conversation. And so as a Chinese American leader, I feel it's my job to be a bridge also. But let's first talk about our city government and the responsibility. So this year, last year, my office with the great help, quite frankly, of my legislative aide, Chelsea Bullard, we created legislation to create the first Office of Racial Equity in the city and county of San Francisco. Most people have said, oh, really? I thought we had one before, but actually we did not. And what does that mean? It means that now we should be collecting data by race, and we should be collecting it looking at certain measures. And when we pass laws in San Francisco, is that there is an Office of Racial Equity to tell us whether or not this will have adverse impacts to particular racial groups. And we had never put that measure before. We had just voted on things that the loudest voice got laws passed, the biggest organizing group got laws passed, but we never really had this analysis about people of color and people in San Francisco. If we do this, how will it then affect people of color? And can we tweak it so it's much more equitable and more racially equitable? And that is actually the job of city government. So we don't keep perpetuating these differences. I always find it quite amazing that even though my family has been here in San Francisco for over 100 years, and my father was in the Korean War, they both worked for the government, I'm an elected official, and yet there is this othering. and really the institutionalized, I think, language and institutionalized thinking of this othering, that there are other people. And quite frankly, when people say, oh, she's one of us or she's not one of us, it is always this separation of the othering. And it's sort of, and I find it somewhat amazing that I can be here, my family can be here almost 100 years, and yet I am still seen as an other, an outsider, and a perpetual foreigner. And we have seen this, I think, more recently with our Trump administration, the dividing of races here, but also this idea that there are certain people that are one of us, and there are other people that are not one of us. And when someone says, oh, you know, like this person is one of us, I'm always thinking, yeah, I am not in that group. And because I think that type of language is very, very harmful. And so yes, we are government, and as your supervisor, it is my job actually to do things, institutionalize policies within our city government that help to minimize actually the adverse effects racially of many of our ordinances and what we do. But it is also about city departments. So is your city department actually serving all people the same and with the same equitable chance? And I'll just give Recon Park as a little example. So when I say to ask Recon Park, how many Black children are learning to swim in San Francisco? And they say to me, you know, we don't know. And I say, well, you know, I've had 3 children. It is very difficult to get your children to swim here. I mean, you got to sign up for classes, a lot of times a lot of money. You got to sit there for half an hour with your kid, 1 day a week. You got to shower them, get them dressed. I mean, this is somebody who doesn't have, isn't working 3 jobs, can do that. And this is like, it's very hard to get your kid to really learn how to swim. But yet this is a basic safety thing that every child should know. And so when I ask him that, he says, well, I don't know, Sandra, we don't collect that data by race. So then how do you know that you're using the city resources in an equitable way? If we still have Black children drowning in 3 feet of water, then you tell me, how are we spending our city dollars off the backs of hardworking San Franciscans? How are you using your city dollars in an equitable way to ensure that everyone has the same chance? Are we setting up barriers for swim lessons to be only for middle-class parents? Are we setting it up, the whole waiting in line and knowing the date and to sign up and being first in line? Are all those mechanisms in order to get your child to learn how to swim in a public swimming pool? Is it too hard for some parents? And if we don't keep this data, how do we know who we are not serving? And so this is what this Office of Racial Equity does. It looks at, it's external facing. How are we serving the general public with our dollars? And are we doing it in an equitable way? And why is this so important? This is important because if we perpetuate this gap, we perpetuate the gap with us coming together and living in a really peaceful society. Because these gaps are what divide us, and these gaps are what causes actually this lack of opportunity, and also this othering, and then also this separation of people rather than people coming together. And I just want to say that also with the Black and Asian community, there are some major challenges. One of them is language. And another thing is, I have to say, Chinese people, they come from a place where everybody is Chinese. San Francisco is a place where people come from all over. It's culturally very different. It is also, we are separated by the language, but yet we are also separated by our city government's lack of action of bringing us all together and having cohesive conversations and coming together as a community. We let these things like language divide us. We let these things like culture divide us when really these things could be uniting us together. And so I just want to say we have a city responsibility. As your city official, I feel like it's my responsibility. When I saw next door once that a neighbor posted, hey, I'm new to the neighborhood and I'm Black. So I just want you to know that, I'm new to your neighborhood. I'm happy to get to know everyone, but was fully aware that he could be victimized and wanted to just put out there, hey, I'm new to your neighborhood, hey, this is who I am, and in a way to keep him safe. And we think about that, when I saw that on next door, kind of broke my heart, because this is how people from outside sort of see us. We don't have a large Black population here. We don't have a large Latinx population here. How can we make those populations feel welcome here? And it isn't by doing this sort of othering type of language. I also just want to say, as a personal responsibility, as a Chinese American, and also personally, knowing that a lot of my people have some really, I think, misguided misconceptions and untruths about the Black community. And it is my job, I feel like, as a Chinese person, to actually be that bridge. Because those of us that understand, I think, our shared experiences together, that understand how us coming together makes this world a much better place, but makes San Francisco a much better place, and makes the Richmond district a much richer place to live in too, is that we can all come together and we can raise our children together, and we can be neighbors, and we can help each other, and we can look out for each other. And I think that starts first with one-to-one, each one reach one, and each one teach one. And I feel like that has been my job as when I was on the school board. It was my job as a community organizer. And I feel like it is my job as your supervisor, but it is my job simply as a human being who really believes that that what we share together is humanity, and humanity is what is going to bring us together. And so I think that all of us have a responsibility actually to check our friends, to check the people we love, to check people that we just hear, or what, and it doesn't have to be confrontational. I always say to people, you can just say, when you hear something, you can just say, hey, you know what, that's not cool. And sometimes that's enough for people to check themselves. But it, you know, it is our responsibility. If we want to change this, we can't put it on somebody else. We can't look at other people and say, oh, you know, I saw something today, oh, it was really disturbing, I was not cool, but then sort of walk away from it. I think that if you are of that group of people that are saying these things that racially divide us, that are inherently racist and oppressive, then I think then it is your responsibility, as it is mine, to call it out and to tell people, you know what, that's not cool. I think, so there's a city responsibility, there's an individual responsibility, and this is something I think that everyone can do every day. And it is not always just calling people out. It is always about it can also be as simple as making someone feel welcome. And, you know, many times I'm saying hello to people on the street and people don't say hello back to me. But I still do it because I just think one person saying hello to you, even though they don't say hello back to you, it's like, it's okay. Because really, it wasn't so I can get a hello back. It was so that they knew that I was saying hello to them. And, you know, many times I just want to say also that as a Chinese person, my daughter lives in Oakland, and I see a lot of Black people in Oakland, and I say hello to them. And I would say a lot of them don't say hello back to me, but I completely understand it, because I bet you they have said hello to Chinese people, and Chinese people have not said hello back to them. But you know what? I'm determined to change that, even if it's just me doing it, or you doing it, or all of us just doing it on a one-to-one basis. This is something we can do, and actually we can do it every day. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Supervisor. Thank you for sharing. It's always great to hear from you. All right, so now I want to introduce our final panelist, Kevine Boggess. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think for me, just to share a little bit about myself, I'm someone who grew up here in San Francisco. I'm part of kind of the first generation in my family that grew up here. A lot of my family kind of originally migrated here from the Midwest and from the South, from Mississippi, you know, with military connections and kind of connected to the Presidio Army base. And so for me as a Black person growing up in San Francisco, I think there's just always been the invisibility of API and the Black community. Not in so much where you wouldn't actually see them around, but where they weren't the center of the city or kind of reflective of what it means to be San Franciscan. It was kind of, as Sandy was talking about, like the otherness. Just thinking about the schools that I grew up to and kind of the unique diasporas of cultures and people that kind of made up our public schools is something that I always remember, and how it exposed me to things that I weren't exposed to at home. Really growing up with a family that was kind of rooted in kind of like a Mississippi reality, and also kind of a Mississippi analysis of the world that was really rooted in kind of a black-white dynamic, that didn't necessarily have an analysis of where Chinese folks or API folks fit into it, or Latino folks, because that wasn't really a part of the dynamic that they experienced. And really trying to navigate the anti-blackness that existed in San Francisco when I was growing up, and even still. And I think in a lot of ways, and I think that the presentation did a really great job of exemplifying the intentionality that was put in to kind of divide our communities and really to separate us. And the fact that, that was done intentionally because people were like racist and didn't like people, but also because it was profitable. And people saw that as a way to make money and to benefit. And I think in a lot of ways, as we are in 2020 and like we've seen all that this year has thrown at us thus far, it's a good reminder of how much more power we have when we're together, and how having one courageous conversation by yourself can really lead to a group of people coming together around a shared idea to push for something more. And I think for me, it's really about how is solidarity our solution to the situation that we're facing? How do we view our communities not as like a melting pot, but almost as like a potluck or like a buffet where we're bringing together the best that we have to offer to kind of share with each other, and really kind of taking all that we have and really making it meaningful. I think as a SFUSD public school student, one thing that really stands out to me as something that I enjoyed, but I also find a little bit challenging was, I guess it was in the 80s when I was in elementary school, as I date myself. We used to have the Chinese New Year celebration, the Lunar New Year celebration in the school, and it was always kind of like this fantastic explosion of like color and celebration. But then I think back to like where was the representation of like API folks in the curriculum, and in the school, like as educators, right? Where were those people centered? Where were those voices, when it wasn't just about like celebrations and dancing? And so I think sometimes we just have to acknowledge that like our appreciation sometimes is tokenizing because it doesn't actually value the fullness of a people or their community, and really create space for them. And I think in a lot of ways we have to create space for each other, and really kind of recognize that we all kind of have different stories. But right now we have kind of a shared story we're creating in San Francisco to kind of be something more. I think one of the ways that I've kind of been thinking about it is like, is San Francisco an American city, or is San Francisco an international city, right? Or is it some way really both, right? How do we find a way to like really say like we represent the best of America by representing the best that this world has to offer, right? And really kind of seeing ourselves as constantly growing, and really learning from each other and saying that this is my neighborhood, this is my community, I'm invested. How can we look out for each other? How do we support each other's growth and development? And really say what's best for me is what's best for you, and how do we come together? I think for me, with a lot of the work that I do is around education equity and really trying to close the racial achievement gap that Black and Latinx students face in the school district. And I also feel that our schools have such a large role to play as far as connecting our different communities and really kind of educating us about what does it mean to be in communication, to be in fellowship with each other. How do we share community practices, cultural practices, and how do we engage with each other in new ways, ways that really kind of push us to think to new solutions to problems that we're having. I think one thing that we're seeing a lot right now, and I think especially playing out in the media, is the Black criminal preying on, the Chinese community. And I think like that is a reality that's happening. There's also a lot of crime in San Francisco as a whole. And it's like, how do we actually address these things and really the root causes, right? Why are people not safe in their communities, and what are we doing as a city to make people feel safe? Not just arrest people and throw them away, right? But what are we actually doing to like reform these issues and fix what's really plaguing our communities? And I think like a challenging part is we can't always rely on other models or examples in the United States to kind of model for us what we need to do. I mean, we have to kind of be courageous and be in the forefront and try and experiment and really look at our history and the different things that kind of have been accomplished. I really think about what happened at San Francisco State University around ethnic studies and the way the whole school community kind of stood up to demand more, to be included and to be seen, and how that's kind of rippled through the state and the nation as people really push back on one of the more formative institutions to kind of shape minds to say that we won't teach a curriculum that doesn't reflect the lives and experience of the people in our city and our community. And even as we struggle with our former mayor, who's the governor, who killed legislation around ethnic studies because people didn't feel included, right? How do we really kind of bridge those barriers, have the hard conversations, and really say, we don't want to go back to where we were. We want to create something new that is reflective of what we know we all deserve, which is a city that treats us with dignity and respect, acknowledges us as individuals, but brings us together as one community, kind of united, working for the common good, to make this city successful and to have everyone in it be successful, and not exploited, but really kind of benefiting in the success and the wealth of the city. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was great. That was amazing. It's so great to meet you and to get to know you better. Thank you. All right. So thank you for all the questions that are coming in. We are just going to go ahead because we are limited on time. We're just going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A part of this forum. If you have questions, again, just keep sending them to us and we will, so we can get them out there. All right, so for the first question is for everyone. I'd love to hear more about what we as ordinary citizens can do to lobby for more equitable policies. How do we try to undo the harm of previous redlining and segregating laws, for example, especially with the increasing economic divide? And let me know if you want me to repeat anything.
Well, I think one thing we can do is actually we can vote this November. You know, a lot of the economic divide is really put on to, I think, working class folks of color. And that, there are a couple of ballot measures actually on a November ballot that redistributes wealth. It is hard, I think, to fight against this enormous wealth that individuals, and I just want to say they are individuals, have acquired in our city. You know, we have a ton of billionaires here. We've got a lot of businesses. Even during COVID, we're thriving here and still making a lot of money. And let's just remember the federal government also actually perpetuates this divide by giving breaks to the top 1% companies, right? Believing in trickle-down economics, which we have not seen the positive effects of that. In fact, it is to the detriment of our working class people of color. And so if you look at this divide as actually being exacerbated by a wealth divide, which it is, I think that there are some things that we can do this November that are on this ballot. And not only that, but also who we vote for as our elected officials. I think it's really important that people that represent us actually have racial equity in mind and in the forefront. And what are they going to do about it? And do they understand about systemic racism? I think, we have seen what a president can do in one term, and it is quite frankly frightening. So this is one thing I think that we can do every, 4 years, every 2 years, and we can vote. And there's an opportunity this November. And so about housing policies, should we be building social housing? There are the powers that be that will fight against this again and again and again. And of course, the billionaires will fight again and again and again to keep their money intact. But we actually, I think many of us believe that this wealth gap really just perpetuates this divide between us. And it's a way, economics is really an effective way to keep people down and hold communities down. It is this, the banks have known this for a long time, and billionaires have known this for a long time. And so I actually think that a lot of it comes down to voting and getting your voice out there. But please join me. Dyan or Kevin, do you want to add something into that?
Yeah, I just put a link into the chat. It's an article that we did at People Power Media. It's called Achieving Equity Through City Planning. So we actually broke down, basically a whole new way that you can think of city planning that would actually create equity, and that, relies on things like, or prioritizes things like desegregation, affordability, stability, sustainability, and not so much on the production of housing, which is, I think, is the major conversation now, is like, we just need to build more housing of any type. And, I think when you look at all of the racist policies and everything, it's really clear that we don't need, a bunch of luxury condos to make the city equitable. It's not going to be affordable to the people living here. It's not going to be affordable to, our kids and to everybody. So what we need is really just a more focus on affordable housing, investing in those programs. Like Sandy said, having, being able to take some of the wealth that's just like amazing. It's like even in the pandemic, we're situated among the most richest, corporations to ever exist in the history of humanity, not even just like, and so to be able to tap into that to provide for the people in the city, is a huge opportunity. So anyway, check out the article, has some really big ideas and specific ones.
And I guess I'll just add briefly, I think just like the intentionality of like continuing the conversation centered on equity, and kind of lifting up kind of this tragic history that kind of brought us here. I think a lot of times as people think about the things that don't bring us equity or fairness or justice, they really are thinking about the future that they want to build, but not really kind of repairing the harm from some of the intentional damage that was caused. And so just to kind of lift up the need to keep equity at the center and in the conversation so that we don't kind of go back to normal, but we stay on guard and aware and kind of spreading the message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that a lot of it is also checking ourselves every day. I know I have to. It's something that, we're all susceptible to media, how we were raised, who our friends are, who influence us. But, a lot of it is media, and it's all the other images that we see. And sometimes we just have to check ourselves and just have to stop and say, wait, stop. Like, what am I really seeing here? And am I really, because, it's really easy to revert back, I think, to the status quo and sort of what the general powers that be really want you to think. And it takes really a sharp mind to be able to say, to sort of flag it and say, wait a minute, what is going on here? And to dig just maybe 2 or 3 levels deeper to what is really going on. And so I just think that we all kind of, need to check ourselves, and probably on a daily basis, of what we see and what we hear and how we conduct ourselves too.
Great, thank you. Next question. What do we gain from working together to increase solidarity between the API and Black communities? Why should I be personally invested in this?
Well, I think that everyone should be personally invested in it if you want to live in a safe society. If you want to live in a community that is safe, and that everyone is taken care of, and that people get along with each other, and you're not fearing your neighbor or people down the block, but that you can see everyone as a peer or a friend, or at the very least an acquaintance. And I just think it makes us safer all around. It makes us, and it also, it eliminates the hate. It it takes down the level of hate that people, I think, are feeling today, and have, I think our president has made it acceptable to use race as a basis to really discriminate, but also to hate people. And so I just think it's, you know, what people say to me, oh, why do we have to get along? Look, no man is an island. We live here with each other. Our houses are so close to each other. I always say on a quiet night, I can hear my neighbor flush her toilet. We live so closely together. And I have to say, having raised 3 children here in the Richmond, I was completely dependent on the other mothers there, people down the block to watch my kids. You know, it takes a village to actually to raise a child here, and to raise a child that is, you know, actually has good opportunities. And so I just think it just makes us all safer. It makes us a happier society. I think it makes a more peaceful society. And I actually think that it shows the rest of the United States, like, you know, that we can do it here in San Francisco. But man, it just comes with, I think, it has to come with a deep sense of humanity. And you can believe in humanity and also in compassion for everyone. I think that these are qualities that have been lacking in our societies of lately. And things have gotten really nasty, and things have gotten really not nice. And I just think, like, really? How's that help you personally? How's that help your mental and emotional health with so much in turmoil and so much hate and so much negativity? Are you doing well with that? Are your children doing well with that? Are your parents doing well with that? I just think we need to take, you know, it's so easy to fall into it. It's much harder to take yourself out of that and put yourself in another space. And so I just think that we should all, why should we do it? We should do it because it makes us all safer. It'll make us all happier. And also it builds a much safer and happier society for everyone.
I think it also builds the political power that's needed to really, you know, undo all of the policies that we've been seeing, and all of the sort of the, you know, I think what hopefully I was able to show is that we have a lot in common, not just, you know, Chinese and API and Black communities, but also all communities of color, as well as all working class people in San Francisco. You know, they all faced, you know, it was white people as well, faced the same difficulties that I talked about with redevelopment and redlining. You know, those were communities that were targeted as well. So I think, you know, I think knowing that we have all of the shared history of oppression, and kind of finding the voice together and saying that we're not going to continue anymore is, you know, hugely powerful, and is, you know, something that I hope that, you know, we can do. And it's just, you know, plus, you know, I actually grew up in Canada, so I have a very different, you know, view of things. So coming from sort of like an outside perspective. And yeah, there it was like really a, like what they used to say, like a tossed salad, not like a melting pot, you know. All of my neighbors were like Trinidadian, Jamaican, Chinese, you know, Portuguese. You knew all of the different ethnicities of like everybody. And we all learned from it and appreciate. I think maybe Kevin probably had a similar experience going to school here. So it's just beautiful, and you just kind of appreciate everybody where they're at.
I think the only thing that I would kind of add is I think we have like an obligation as people who kind of live in a country that was kind of founded on stealing and murdering and enslaving people, to kind of really fight back against those things in the current moment, and really kind of leverage our privilege as people in this country, to kind of, you know, fight back against these forces and the impact that they have globally. So I think that it also kind of puts like a greater burden on us to understand that, like, we are the 1% of the world in a lot of ways, right? And with that comes a little bit of extra responsibility and burden, even though I think it goes beyond, you know, just what we experience, but really to kind of be a voice for justice and human rights, in a way that it's easy not to be when you have kind of some of the luxuries that being in such a wealthy city and nation kind of can provide you.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, next question. What's your definition of community safety? What is your definition of community safety? There was some comment trying to find out too, what has been the response to the city's efforts to approach policing in a different way by redirecting resources? So sort of that was the context of the question. What has been the general response to the city's efforts to approach policing in a different way by redirecting resources? And what is your definition of community safety?
I can go first because I was really ready to go first already. Um, I would say my definition, like the most practical things that I can think of like a safe community is I would love to be able to leave my doors unlocked, said as a person who locks even the inside doors when I go into a room. I'd love to live in a city where if you left your wallet on the ground, you'd be pretty sure somebody would like get it back to you. I think in a lot of ways it's like that feeling that you're not being preyed upon or being kind of threatened while you're just kind of being yourself. And that you know that if something were to occur, that you aren't alone and isolated, but that you're actually in a place where people will run to support you. So that's kind of what it centers on for me. In my perspective of what kind of the city has done, um, I feel the city has done a good job in taking a first step and kind of verbalizing a commitment to kind of moving away from policing. I think in the abstract, like if you just look at that, that is great. And compared to other cities, like we're leaps and miles ahead of kind of where they're trying to get to. But when you kind of look at the history of the police department in San Francisco and the criminal justice system here, and just how unjust and racist and biased it has been in the history of it, and the severe lack of accountability, especially when it comes to violence towards poor people and black people and queer people that never really is taken into account. Um, we're not necessarily moving fast enough, and I don't necessarily feel like our city has been educated and kind of learned in the ways that aren't policing as the only response to violence. I think that kind of people think if I don't have the police, I gotta have a gun because we're shooting people if they're acting up. And I think like that's kind of reflective of what we've kind of learned public safety to mean in San Francisco. Like public safety means the police will come and bust up some heads like if they need to, versus we have resilient communities that support each other and we're actually identifying people who are going through challenging things that might make them like harm the community or themselves and getting them the supports they need kind of before they get to that place, right? And then having ways to hold them accountable, not to a justice system in isolation, but to the actual community that maybe that they're a part of and the community that they harmed, right? Because that harm is two ways, right? It doesn't just it's not just between them and the other individual, but actually the community as a whole who no longer feels safe because of that action.
Yeah, I was chair of the budget committee, and so this year was a lot of people demanding, I think, to defund the police, right? But I think, I just want to say that I actually think the police department would agree with us, and the chief does, is that there are things that the police actually shouldn't be responding to. It's not criminal. They shouldn't be responding to it. It is not criminal to be homeless. They actually don't have the resources to serve people that are homeless. We need to send people out there that actually have the expertise to deal with people with severe mental illness, and also people who deal with chronic homelessness or homelessness. I mean, those are the people that we should be sending out there. And so when we talk about, I think what's happened is that we have allowed ourselves to think that public safety equals law enforcement, when actually it's just one piece of public safety. If you look at public safety as this really big umbrella, then you would see that the police and law enforcement is actually what steps in when all these other factors have not been put in place. And I'm not going to say that these factors are difficult to put in place. I think they are, because we have not actually thought of them as public safety. So I'm just going to put something out there like, early childhood education. We say, how is that public safety? You know, it is, in fact, an important part of public safety, because when we look at our educational achievement divide, we see that it starts way before kindergarten. It starts before that. And so what causes overall crime and people to commit these crimes? You look at the lack of opportunity, we look at trauma that has not been healed, we look at all these things that actually we should have taken care of as a society so that we can actually prevent people from committing crimes and harming each other. And I think that what we have bought into is that the police can actually solve these problems when police actually step in many times when it is actually too late. They respond to crime. Police do not stop crime, prevent crime. They respond to it. And so it is up to us as a society to put in all these other public safety measures, the wraparound services, the counseling for teenagers, making sure everyone has adequate housing. We get back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, are you fed? Do you feel safe? And I'm talking about 5-year-olds and 4-year-olds. You know, are we wrapping a safety net around these children? You know, when we have these disparities in our communities, like for example, in San Francisco, we have one of the highest rates of Black infant mortality in San Francisco. That Black babies die at a much higher rate than white babies, 9.2 per 1,000 compared to 2.6 for white babies. But we have one of the highest Black infant mortality rates in the nation. And yet we have one of the largest economies here in California, but in San Francisco too. Our budget is more than some countries, quite frankly. And that we still have this inequity. And it just points out that we are not investing in the things that make us a healthy society. This divide, people hungry, people traumatized, people living in shelters, children not having safe places to stay, adequate housing to live in, their parents working 3 and 4 jobs. I mean, these are the things that actually lead later to the lack of opportunity that causes actually much of this crime. So these safety net factors, the nonprofits that we fund for the after school programs, so kids aren't going home by themselves and staying in a house by themselves, but actually there's caring adults in that are providing for them to help them to be successful. These things that we invest in is actually really important and a really important part of public safety. It is perhaps even more important than our police, because these are the factors that can actually change lives. These are the factors that can actually be so profound in somebody's life that they grow to be successful or not. And so when we look at who is committing crimes and we need to call the police, we look at things like mental illness, we look at anger, we look at trauma, we look at all these things that cause crime and sometimes very violent crimes. We look at those and, you know, when people are arrested and they do these crimes, I just want to say that we as a society has failed. When I see a 16-year-old that has committed a murder, my question is, so how did we fail that 16-year-old? Because it's only being alive 16 years and has done this type of harm to somebody else and such a heinous crime. What have we done as a society and what could we have done? But look at our systems. Look at our foster care system. Look at our system of child protective services. Look at all these things that we put in place that are supposed to be a safety net for our children in our growing society. And then look at our adults that we cast away. Look at the adults that have lost jobs and then we don't believe in retraining them or employment opportunities because we actually don't invest in them. So if you are hungry, you got nowhere to go, you're trying to feed your family or feed yourself, what would you do? And so these things that we can invest in to help prevent crime, remember, police, they react to crime. And I think they'd be the first to tell you that, you know, they don't prevent crime, they react to it. And I think by then we as a society has blown it too, because we should be investing in these safety nets. It's just that I think our law enforcement agencies have been overfunded, whereas our other parts of public safety have been severely underfunded. And that also starts with public education.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, we have time for one last question. And that is, how can I show up for others and be a better ally?
I think listening is probably the most important thing. Hearing people where they're at, and really being, wanting to know what their perspective is, and really putting yourself into their shoes.
I would just add being intentional with what you are an ally around. I feel like sometimes it's very easy to kind of be like, I'm an ally for Black lives. I don't want Black people to die. I'm here for that. But like, well, what does that actually mean substantially? Like, are you actually opposed to kind of like the criminalization of Black people by the criminal justice system? And I think because then it allows you to show up in ways that kind of reflect your allyship, and also allow you to kind of become a student of these issues and kind of learn more so that you can actually be an ally that is kind of connected and understanding what it means to be an ally and how it's supportive versus just being aligned with the issues or kind of having an empathetic feel towards it. I think that it's really easy to kind of passively be like, I support good things and I don't like bad things without ever really taking a firm stance on anything. And so I would just lift that up. Um,
Yeah, I think that it's also, um, there are, I think what Kevin says is really true. It's one thing to say like, oh, Black Lives Matter, but then on the other side of your mouth, you're saying, you know what, lock them up and throw away the key. These people, like we don't like. It's just sort of. I've been so shocked actually working for the city is that the lack of investment in people. I mean, when you talk about, um, the majority, I mean, Black people make up like a disproportionate amount of homeless people. And that, when I keep hearing people like, oh, arrest our way out of homelessness, I'm just thinking, look at what our prison complex has done. Are you really okay with like a vast majority of Black men being incarcerated? I mean, and Black men between the ages of 19 and like 35. It's like, so many of them are locked up. Like, are you really okay with that? And I just think that it's really about sort of, I think, educating yourself more, but also really checking yourself. Like you're saying this because yeah, it sounds good, but when it gets down to it, really, what are you really willing to say that you will go against? That the status quo that we are living with is wrong and that we need to change it. So are you part of the change, or are you just part of reaffirming the status quo? And I just think, it's a changing world. Look, I'm 63. I have a hard time with it too. I mean, things that I think that how I was raised in the 60s and the 70s, right? And I just think like the world is always changing, but we're always learning too, more and more about how these systems don't serve us well. And they serve a certain population, but even not well, because quite frankly, it doesn't make us safer. And so when we look at what's happening, and I think that, as a school board member and as a supervisor, okay, hey, I know I'm not Black, but I am talking to a lot of Black people, and I am trying to really understand what are the things that I can really support that would help them. And I just think, Black people can't be the only ones saying it. We all have to be saying it. If we say that there is a racial achievement gap and we want to see that gap closed, it can't just be Black people saying it. It actually has to be Chinese people. It has to be white people. It has to be Asian people and Latinx people. We all have to be saying this too, because it is just wrong that we would have a whole population of people of a certain race that really have the highest scores for non-graduation, highest scores for unemployment, highest scores for numbers for incarceration, for all these things. Why? Why are we in a society which is like so sophisticated, self-proclaimed most progressive city in the United States, and also over $13 billion budget, and we would have this really high Black infant mortality rate? I mean, you just kind of have to ask yourself, hey, is this really working? And is there a better way to do it? And so part of it is, you know, checking your own paradigm. And it's also opening up your mind and your heart. And quite frankly, I think it has been hard to do in the age of, number 45 as our president. And I think it's separated us even more. We're hoping this November we'll have a different outcome. But I just have to say, like, all of us then, we all need to take a second look. And so this is what we can do, actually, I think, to open up our minds a little bit. Yeah, it's a changing world. Sometimes it changes too fast for me too. But I will say that I think people have been waiting for this change. And I actually think democracy is messy, but the product is so much better.
Thank you so much, Supervisor. And I just want to, in closing, just thank our panelists, Dyan and Kevin. Thank you both so much. It has been amazing to have all three of you with us. And I have, you've given us a lot to think about. It's really exciting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I just want to add real quick too. It's in the future, if these are of interest to the community and we want to continue to do these things, we want to look into other topics. And so we want to hear from you all about what is the next deep dive, or even just scratching. These are all just really just scratching the surface, but because there's so much more work we have to do. But what else will help us help us educate our community and be a better Richmond district? And I think that this panel really is just one step in helping us get there. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we will, we're going to schedule our next panel. It'll most likely be in January 2021. And yeah, we will be in touch with you about how to be an anti-racist. We're going to go ahead and I will send you an email. Thank you for coming today. It's been an incredible discussion. And yeah, we look forward to talking with y'all soon. Thanks so much. Bye.